Niger, Central African Republic, and a whole host of others, including even North African country. So I am not surprised that still more overtures are being made. It is more like a scramble between the East and the West, and that's exactly what we are witnessing. So indeed, I'm not surprised that Russia is making overtures in Africa because there's a lot at stake.
But what does it come with? And I'm talking about Russia as a key security partner for Africa. Countries like Russia and China have been known to, in fact, that's what they often position themselves as not getting involved in countries' domestic affairs, but they've also been singled out as providers of weaponry, which continues to fuel conflicts on the African continent. So a bit of a muddled picture if we're going to say they're going to help silence the guns.
Well, I do know, for example, in Mali and Burkina Faso, the Russians have come in to help counter the threat of terrorism, especially after the departure of the French and the Americans, especially also in Niger. But I must say that hasn't been enough to stop the violence. Almost on daily basis, we are seeing more audacious, more attacks by particularly Jenim and Kasiba Masina, the terrorist groups operating very prevalent in Burkina Faso and Mali. We are seeing them stage more attacks by the day. And basically what this means is the intervention of the Russians hasn't been enough to stop the violence.
I'm curious as to the global security architecture and the role that Russia can play. You spoke about the Sahel region, for instance, what Russia has been doing. Yet in the past, the Wagner Group, which has been said to have close ties with, Russia's oligarchy, has also been used or been instrumental in some of the conflicts in the Sahel region. So what positioning, what posturing does Russia now take up at this particular summit? And murmurings that it should make to be seen as the security partner to be with.
Well, definitely, it's quite obvious that the Russians are trying to paint a certain picture. They are trying to paint a picture to the effect that they are a more reliable partner. They are not going to ask for too much before giving. They are not going to influence your foreign policy. They are not going to influence your economic policy before giving. And they want to be seen as coming to help, But of course, there are some benefits to this because we do know that in West Africa, the Russians have taken over certain mines. They mine natural resources in exchange for security support that they have given these, countries. We also know for a fact that the Russians, through the Wagner, have been engaged in combat missions, particularly in West Africa against these terrorist groups. So surely the Russians want to portray a reliable partner kind of relationship, but whether that is working to counter the threats posed by the terrorist groups and other non-state actors in the various regions within the continent is what we are unable to tell. But surely the figures paint a rather disturbing picture. In Burkina Faso, which is very close to Ghana, almost on daily basis, we are recording more attacks, some of them too close for comfort, very close to the Ghana border. Periodic basis, we have thousands of Burkinabes streaming into Ghana in the thick of the night because their communities have been attacked. All this despite the presence of the Russians. we also do know, and it's been recorded, particularly in Mali, that the Russians, through Wagner, have engaged in human rights violations. There's a lot of evidence that has been documented by even the Human Rights Watch. But the same can also be said of the Western countries, especially France, that was there before the Russians came in. So I think it is a very difficult situation for many African leaders. It's like getting caught between a brick or rock and a hard place.
And especially now, if sorry to jump in, because I'm thinking of what is happening now as we speak, negotiations between Kigali and Kinshasa, spearheaded by the United States, which itself has AFRICOM on African soil and would want to entrench further its own security personnel presence.
Well, I mean, surely the Americans would still want to assert some level of influence despite the coming in of the Russians. They've not been comfortable with the gains made by the Russians lately, especially the popular support the Russians are getting on the ground. I mean, we've seen a lot of protests and a lot of celebrations in favor of the Russians. We've seen instances where the military takes over government and people come out in the thousands waving Russian flags and all that. So the Americans are not so pleased about it yet. They are also doing the very best they can, mostly through economic means, to keep some level of influence within the continent, because there's a lot at stake for the Americans. There are a lot of American companies operating all over Africa, and it's in their best interest, strategic interest for that matter, to ensure that influence remains. So, like I indicated at the beginning of the interview, look, it is more like a scramble. Okay, yes. Any means possible, any opportunity that comes, the Russians or Americans would have to grab it, and that is exactly what we're witnessing. And I remember what the Zambian president said. He said, look, the fact that we're friends with the Russians doesn't make us enemies to the Americans. We need to push what is in the best interest of our countries. We can be friends with both the East and the West. So Ghana, for example, is non-aligned. I mean, we're not supposed to take sides. So I see a lot of African countries trying to play that game of, dealing with both the Russians and the Americans.
And I don't know how fair this is, and I'm saying this based on the criticism leveled at it and the actions that it's taken, and I'm pointing a finger precisely at President Ruto of Kenya, his involvement with the U.S., particularly its presence in Haiti, how it's been seen. So let's talk about the pros and cons of that. Non-alignment is something that's gotten South Africa into hot water, particularly while it takes a very strong stance on what is happening in the Middle East, the Israeli attacks on Gaza. So if we're talking about the shifting of tectonic plates and the importance of further entrenching multilateralism, how important a chance is this, particularly for the global south? Because we know the BRICS countries are going to be there, along with other African countries. South Africa is head of the G20, and there's going to be the upcoming G7 meeting soon.
Well, Africa has a lot to benefit from the Americans. It has a lot to benefit from the Russians. Let's not forget that we're getting a lot of Russian technology in our defense industry, in our trade and commerce. We also rely to a very large extent on grain products from Russia and other countries near the Russian mainland. I remember when Russia invaded Ukraine, and there was a blockade of the grains movement, how pathetic it became, so to speak, for many African countries that relied largely on grains from Russia and Ukraine. Okay, so it is in the best interest of the a lot of countries within Africa to strike a balance, to be very meticulous for that matter in their relationships between the East and the West. I remember about 2 years ago, Ghana's president was in Washington. He met then Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. And unfortunately, before the international media, he spoke about the activities of the Russians in Burkina Faso and thought that it is a security risk to Ghana. It wasn't well received at all. I mean, a lot of Ghanaians, including myself, spoke against it because it presented to us a diplomatic nightmare between Ghana and, of course, Burkina Faso. Later, the Ghana government realized that, hey, it was a monumental mistake. So they reached out to the Burkinabes, first through the national security minister, who went there and pacified the wars, so to speak. Then later, President Nana Dankwa Akufo-Addo followed up and apologized to the junta for those remarks that he made. And the Russians, of course, were not also happy about that. So we need to maintain that non-aligned posture going forward.
Adib, I need to leave it here, but I really do thank you for your time and your insights. Much appreciated. Adib Saani, foreign policy and security analyst based in Ghana's capital, Accra. And of course, while we're speaking about this, I'm sure you would have heard by now that the AFDB's new president has been appointed, and that is Mauritania's former finance minister.